Hi everyone, thank you for logging in this afternoon. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. We are recording this webinar, so you'll be able to access the recording once it's finished. We'll send you a link to it. My name is Emily Cook. I'm a business psychologist at Thrive, and we're going to be talking today about how you can support a remote team. I don't have a co-host with me today, so I am going to try and monitor the chat as we go along. But for any of you that haven't used Zoom before, there is a Q&A function which you can access. And throughout the webinar, if you want to just pop in any questions that you have, I will get to them at the end. So hopefully everyone can hear me and we will get started. So we're going to talk about, first, just a bit of an introduction into actually the kind of impact that line managers can have on their employees' well-being. It's probably not going to be a new topic for you, and I would hope that most of you will have some kind of understanding about this. But there's actually a lot of research that shows that there are a lot of people managers that still aren't entirely aware of the kind of things that they should be looking out for or how they can significantly impact their team. So we're going to start by just doing a bit of an introduction to that and mental health. We're then going to explore what kind of challenges you might face managing a remote team. Some of you might be used to having a team that works from home a lot or is dispersed across the UK or in different time zones. But for many people, we're in a really new period of time. So it's going to be a bit of an adjustment having to manage an entirely remote team. So there are challenges and we're going to explore what they might be. But then we're going to go on to some practical tips and resources that you can use. So first of all, mental health, it is just like physical health. So it's something that we all have and we need to take care of it. Good mental health means generally being able to think, feel and react in ways that you need and want to live your life. But if you go through a period of poor mental health, you might find that the ways you're frequently thinking or feeling or reacting become difficult or even impossible to cope with. And this can feel just as bad as a physical illness or even worse. We know from research that mental health is also linked to physical health. So if I have an underlying health condition, such as diabetes or cancer or musculoskeletal disorder, it can increase my risk of developing poor mental health. And on the flip side of that, if I have a poor mental health condition, it can be quite challenging to maintain good physical health. And often we see comorbidity with mental and physical health problems. Mental health problems are very common, as I'm sure you're aware. They affect around 1 in 4 people in any given year. So it's really crucial as people managers that you understand the role that you play in the well-being of your employees. Mental health is obviously also very complex. So it's influenced by a range of factors, biological factors and genetics, social influences and psychological factors. What we're going to be discovering today or looking into a bit more detail is that social impact. And this is where you really have an opportunity to make both a positive and a negative impact on someone's mental health. We'll start by looking at this curve. I'm not sure whether anyone is familiar with this, but it's the YatesDodson curve. And it's designed to represent optimum levels of arousal. And this can be relative to stress or other factors. But in this scenario, we're going to talk about it in terms of stress. So if we have a look at this middle part of the curve, the idea of this is that everyone has an optimum level of performance. So if I have absolutely no stress in my work or my life, then I'll probably be down here by the left-hand side of the curve. And if you have very, very little stress, it can cause things like lower motivation, lack of engagement. And this you might expect if you have someone that works in a very monotonous or repetitive job role. It can be really hard to actually improve their engagement because the stress levels are so low. But then on the flip side of that, if stress becomes too much and you have too much to deal with, then it also impacts your productivity and performance. So there's this real idea that there is an optimum level, and for every person it will be different. So for me personally, I know that if I have a deadline for something that is 6 weeks away, I don't really feel that much pressure to get it done. And I know that I am more likely to do it and do it well when I've got about a week or two to go. But there are other people that are a lot more meticulous and prefer to spend much more time preparing for something, because they might not enjoy having that much pressure on their shoulders. So it's really important for a line manager to understand not only your own threshold, but also your team's, and know that each person will be different and that many factors contribute to this threshold. So our experiences, the kind of social support we have, our own cognition and resilience. And this can be very much tested in a time like now. So people's normal thresholds, they might be finding that that's slightly different because they've now got other challenges and pressures to deal with, such as working from home and managing, small children or their homeschooling, as well as keeping yourself healthy and fit and caring about people within your social network. So it creates us a bit of a challenge, but it's just important to know as a people manager that you need to be aware that not everyone will respond to stressful situations in the same way, which means you obviously have to adjust the way that you respond to them. So we'll explore line manager impact now. As a bit of context, mental health, although it's been readily talked about, it is still the elephant in a room in quite a lot of workplaces, and employees are reluctant to raise the subject for fear of discrimination, and managers often shy away from the subject because they're worried about making matters worse or even provoking legal consequences. There was a recent report done in 2019 that found that 62% of managers said that at some point they'd had to put the interests of their company above staff well-being, either sometimes, regularly, or every day. And this is quite pertinent because we know that well-being is really heavily talked about a lot, but talking about it and practicing it are two different things. So this culture of silence means that undetected mental health issues can spiral into a crisis, which can obviously result in sickness absence, higher levels of presenteeism, and increased staff turnover. And many employers still feel uncertain about what their responsibilities around protecting employees actually is, as well as how to make suitable and reasonable adjustments for people that might be experiencing mental health problems. So there is a large body of organisational research that has found that the employee-supervisor relationship is one of the biggest causes of stress at work. And if you haven't got a good or supportive management structure, it can increase issues such as presenteeism and absenteeism. For anyone that doesn't know what presenteeism is, it's defined as an employee coming to work when they should be staying at home. So if I'm feeling ill, but I feel pressure from my employer to not take a day off, then I'm more likely to come into the office, and therefore my productivity will be lower. And if this isn't dealt with, over time, it can lead to longer term sickness absence and more serious stress and health-related conditions. So line managers obviously you have a lot of stress on yourself as well as managing everyone else's, and it can create a ripple effect. One of the benefits, I suppose, of working from home and having a remote team is that you're not going to have immediate contact with your team. So if you are feeling quite under pressure, in an office environment, things can get quite heated, and it can be really easy to snap at someone without realizing it, or behave in a way that maybe you regret later on down the line. But when you're in this kind of environment, it's a lot easier to just take some time and digest it before then communicating to your staff. So it can be easier to stop those kind of ripple effects from happening. But leadership and the ways of actually managing employees, we know are key determinants of employee health, wellbeing and engagement. And we will explore some of the kind of key standards you should be looking for and creating in your team a bit later on. But one of the ways to do that is by modelling healthy behaviour. So I'm sure everyone has experienced at some point a manager who works very late in the evening or logs on to their emails first thing in the morning, and you wake up 6 in the morning and you have an email there, or equally later at night. We obviously have the benefit of technology, which is fantastic, but if you send emails out of business hours, you are already creating the culture that you're expecting your team to work outside of those hours as well. I'm not saying that it's not right to work outside of those hours. I know personally for me, I am a lot more, I'm better at doing my work later on in the day. And sometimes if I wake up first thing in the morning, I like to get through emails before clocking on to my normal working day. But I schedule emails, and that's what is really important. If you set the culture that it's okay to start emailing and having meetings or calls outside of those core hours, you can start to put pressure on people and make them feel like they need to be doing that as well. So just really important that you just model that healthy behaviour and set examples of working to your team so that they don't feel like they need to be mirroring what you're doing or what someone else is doing. Line managers also can cause stress. Obviously, I'm sure that you've all had experiences of management that can create an unsuitable working environment. Again, you know, everyone's human, so managers, just like workers, are all going to be under stress, but it's how you deal with that and how you communicate with your employees that makes a difference. And then finally, line manager impact can really improve engagement. So if you've got a good relationship with your team and with your line manager, we generally see a higher level of engagement and higher motivation and therefore productivity. So sometimes it can be really easy to get caught up in the everyday working schedules, and you might sort of not really put as much time into really establishing a strong foundation and a good relationship between your team. But once you have that in place, the productivity and the engagement comes, and you will see less turnover, less absenteeism, and you just have a better working culture. So that moves on to the next point of strong line manager support has been found significantly to lower employee stress and burnout. The next role of a line manager, which hopefully some people are aware of, but it can also be a bit of a new territory, is actually identifying psychosocial hazards as part of your role. So when we talk about hazards, it's something that has the potential to cause harm. And then we think of the risk of those, and risk is the chance of that hazard actually having an impact. When we talk about psychosocial hazards, we're thinking about things that are in someone's immediate working environment that might have an impact on their well-being. So we talk about job design, we might talk about working hours. So there's a lot of research that has shown that shift workers are at a higher risk of developing issues with their mental health due to their working patterns. We also have things like your line manager support, team cohesion. There might be bullying or harassment in the workplace. So there's loads of different factors that can feed into this psychosocial working environment that can either positively influence well-being, also negatively influence it. There's been a lot of published research on what kind of things can influence this, and we'll talk about a tool later on that you can use to better understand this if you're not already aware of it. So some of the challenges of managing a remote team, I'm sure that many of you are already facing some of these already. If you are in a new environment of having to manage everyone remotely, then there might be things that you've not come across before. So hopefully we can give you some advice later on. But one of the things is less contact. So you might be used to communicating with your team in person, especially if you are primarily office-based. So this can present challenges with adjusting to a new way of working. But if you are used to managing a remote team, it can still be hard to maintain frequent contact with people. But then that begs a question of, how do we know what is too much or what is too little? And this can be hard to establish, but it does involve just actually communicating with both individual members and the wider team. So for example, with our team, when we first went into lockdown, we had a group chat to say, okay, how often do people want to keep in contact? And we agreed as a team that we would have a meeting on a Monday morning just to talk about what we were doing for the week, and then one on a Friday afternoon that was going to be a little bit more fun, you know, whether it be a quiz or, you know, talking about what we're doing at the weekend, as limited as that might be. But the point is that we all had feedback, and we were all given an opportunity to say what we preferred, and some of the team wanted to have more regular feedback with our manager, and others wanted less. So it's important to establish that. It's hard to keep track of performance. This is particularly if you're in a kind of work where you have strict KPIs or you're sales driven. It can be really difficult to keep track of performance, especially if you've been used to being in an office environment and having that regular contact. And what this can actually do is start to, without realizing it, break down the barriers of trust or increase things like micromanagement. It can be really, really easy to want to check in with your team on a really regular basis to find out how they're doing, what they're doing. And that is fine, but it can create this feeling of micromanagement, and it can actually have the opposite effect to what you think it will. So this can be quite a key challenge. Setting schedules, working different hours, obviously during the current situation, can be quite challenging. I know for me, I've changed the way that I work in comparison to when I'm in the office. So it can be hard to get everyone's diaries up to scratch. But this is going to be probably more relevant if you've got a team that are dispersed across different time zones. So not being able to have people joining onto a meeting at the same time if they've got, you know, if their day is your night. So this can be quite challenging. The next one is a lack of cohesion. So sometimes if you have a remote team that are used to working in the office, you know, you've already hopefully got that team bonding already there, but the levels of communication can break down, which means that you can lose that cohesion. If people don't know what other members of their team are doing during that week, if you're only responding to people via email and not really having those phone conversations or video calls, it can start to feel like you are working independently. And this brings me on to the next point, which is about isolation. This is a big risk factor for people that work in remote job roles. So we work with a lot of employees that are, for example, field-based engineers, and a lot of their job is remote and they work by themselves. There is emerging research that shows that some people are actually more equipped to work in isolation than others. So people that have chosen those kind of job roles are probably going to be able to deal with isolation a lot better. But there are going to be people that are forced to work remotely or from home that aren't necessarily well equipped to deal with it initially. So this is where line manager support really comes in. And then finally, supporting. So again, if you are used to having the regular contact with your team, this is where it's easier to support people, because you can see if there's been any changes in the way that they're feeling or behaving. When you don't have that contact, it is harder to actually give them support, especially if you don't know that there's anything wrong in the first place. So what can you do? Encourage regular temperature checks. So this isn't just having a weekly catch up with your whole team to find out what they're doing for the week. It doesn't have to be work focused. And you might want to do this depending on how big your team is. You might want to do this with smaller groups, or the whole team, or individuals. but it's simply about asking how are they doing, and not necessarily about the work, but also checking in with them to see, are you finding this challenging? What are you finding is working for you? Is there anything else that we can do to support you? How are you finding your job? Giving them the opportunity to talk through any potential problems they have. Talk to workers about their home setup. I'm sure that most of you are aware that if you are working full-time from a laptop, this can create some risks for your for musculoskeletal disorders. So if you're constantly sat bent over, hunched over, and in a position that isn't really good for you, then it can create issues such as RSI and different issues with your muscles and bones. So this is really important to make sure that you are giving the right resources to your teams. This might not be something that is really easy to do initially, but over time you can make sure that, have you got a desk? Have you got the right setup? What kind of chair have you got? And where possible, if they don't have the right equipment, then you should be providing that. So that might need a conversation with HR or with occupational health. It depends on the processes of your organisation, but just making sure that as a manager that you are having that conversation to ask people what their home setup is like. Always important, highlight the importance of self-care. Remote workers can sometimes feel pressure to work longer hours to almost prove that they're working, especially if they're not used to it. They might feel like they have to show that they're working more or outside of normal hours to actually prove that they are doing the work. But working longer hours obviously doesn't mean that they're being more productive. So it's important, again, we go back to the modelling of healthy behaviour, to make sure that you are promoting taking regular breaks, doing some exercise, whether it be in the house, in the garden, or just going out for the walk during the day, and encouraging your workers to really stick to a schedule and not get into the habit of working outside of business hours, and really setting those boundaries. Schedule regular reviews. You can do this as a one-to-one, or you might want to just do it on a weekly basis with the whole team. So make sure that you are, where possible, doing it over, something where you have face-to-face contact. We are all doing really well with this at the moment, I think, but it's really important to try and encourage your team to have face-to-face catch-ups where possible. But equally, knowing that not everyone will feel comfortable doing that. So just giving the option there. Tone of voice is crucial when no face-to-face contact is achievable. When you are having a conversation with your team, especially if you're talking to an individual member, and you might be talking to them about something that is non-work related, or you might be having a conversation with them because you're concerned about their well-being, you need to make sure that you're not distracted or doing other things when you're having this conversation, because it really shows. So if I'm talking to you, but I'm also reading an email, or I'm quickly trying to respond to something, it is really obvious in your tone of voice. And this can be a real trap that some people fall into, because if you are busy and you've got a big team and you feel like you need to catch up with everyone, but you also have your own job to do, that can be quite challenging. So you have to manage it in the best way possible for yourself as well as them. But if you can, make sure that when you do schedule time to catch up with your team, block out time in your diary so that you're not going to be feeling like you need to be doing other things at the same time. Encourage team catch-ups that aren't work related. We know that team cohesion is a really significant factor, and having that kind of social support network at work is really important. Some people aren't naturally extroverted, and some people struggle to build relationships with their wider team. So it's important you try and encourage team building exercises, whether it's just a Friday afternoon catch up. We've been doing quizzes, for example. Now our core business function is an app, so we've got a big development team, and we don't have as much communication with them normally, but we've started doing these team quizzes, and actually everyone's getting involved in it, and it's giving people the opportunity to just have something fun to do. And I think as an indirect effect of that, people are starting to feel a bit more comfortable as a team. So small things like that can really make a difference. ensure you dedicate enough time to the conversation. This really goes back to what I was saying before about tone of voice. Make sure you block out time in your diary, especially if you are having a one-to-one with someone, whether it be work related or if you are concerned about them, making sure that you put in significant time to talk to them so that you're not going to get distracted. Encourage peer support. So this doesn't necessarily have to include you, but encourage your team to keep in touch, whether that be through their own chat group or having their own meetings each week, but encourage them to share experiences. And this might start by you actually encouraging that yourself and saying, you know, what's everyone found that's worked this week? Is there anything that people have struggled with? I know I've struggled with this, you know, has anyone got any tips? Encourage that kind of sharing culture, because it allows people to start troubleshooting, and it also creates a culture that it's okay to talk about things that aren't necessarily work related, and it's okay to then work through things together that some people might be finding challenging. This goes without saying, adopting a supportive management style. And remember that not everyone responds to management in the same way. So one person might prefer to have regular check-ins and for you to be not necessarily on their case, but checking in with them on a regular basis and asking them how things are going, what are they doing, or setting them tasks, or just going through what they have on for that week. But then equally, there are other people that want barely any touch time at all. So it's important that you are both flexible and supportive as much as possible. Rely on internal and external services to support you. There's a lot that falls on the shoulders of a people manager. Most people end up wearing multiple hats, and you're not only responsible for just looking after your team, but you're also doing your own job as well. So it can be quite hard to balance the two, especially when you're in a period of extreme pressure or it's a busy time. So make sure that you utilize what resources are available to you. A lot of companies have access to an employee assistance program, which is specifically for employees as well as line managers for in the moment support. HR are also a fundamental resource that you should be using if you are concerned about someone within your team, or you're not sure what kind of adjustments to make, if there are any that are needed, as well as occupational health. And there's also resources online as well that can help. And I will give you some of those that you can familiarise yourself with later. Finally, prepare an appropriate lone working reporting schedule. So obviously for people that are new to working from home and remote working, this can be quite challenging again, because some people might not know how much contact to have with their managers or how often they should be checking in. So make it really clear. And this needs to be on an individual basis, because like I said, some people are going to be working completely different hours now. So check in with your individual team members as well as a group to come up with ways, a time that everyone is happy with checking in, maybe once a week, but then individual members as well, and how they would like to communicate. And finally, look after yourself. So remember that you are only human and will find things hard as well. So it's important that you are using resources to support yourself, because if you feel better and if you're managing your stress well, then this is going to have a direct impact on the rest of your team. So it's okay to not know the answers or to struggle. And I think that's a really important factor, because some people feel the pressure that they have to not only be okay for themselves, but be okay for everyone else. So now we'll look at some of the resources that you can use. Hopefully most of you will have access to the Thrive app. For anyone that's joined that doesn't have it, we have the app, and there's lots of resources on there to help individuals manage their levels of stress, build resilience, and also manage any underlying mental health conditions. So if you do have access to it, you just need an access code from your employer. And this is something that you can be really encouraging your team members to use. It's clinically approved. We've got NHS approval, so we use evidence-based techniques in there which are effective at reducing stress and building resilience to a range of mental health conditions. There's also a mood meter tracker which you can keep on top of how you're feeling day to day and notice whether there are any specific situations that are making you feel a certain way. But this is a really powerful tool for people to use. So understanding that it's there and it's available is something that you can talk to your team about if you have it. Aside from that, some of you will have an employee assistance program. This is there for in the moment support. EAPs are typically very underutilized. So, and that's either because people don't know that they're there or they don't know what they're for. So be aware of, if you do have an EAP, how to contact them and what they can support with. EAPs are able to support with a variety of things, not just mental health related. They can help people who are having issues with their finances, who are facing issues with landlords or tenancies, relationship problems, as well as work-related issues. So this is a really, really helpful resource that is often underutilized, which you can rely on. Next is training. A report that was produced in 2019 found that actually only 13% of managers in the UK had received some form of mental health training. Lots of businesses are being proactive about upskilling their people managers in this area and providing specific training, but there are still far too many that aren't. So as a manager, it's important to be proactive about your own training and learning. So if you've not been given a chance to do this yet, it's something that you should raise with your own manager, because it's becoming more and more pertinent to be aware of the causes of poor mental health, the signs that someone might be struggling, and how to actually deal with them and have a conversation. Simply ignoring it isn't going to make it go away. So it's important that you align yourself with the right skills. Peer support is a really, really important one, and this can be from someone within or outside of your organisation. So again, as a manager, you might feel sometimes out of your depth, or there might be things that you come up against that you've not dealt with before, and you're not expected to have all of the answers right then and there. So it's important to try and establish a peer support network of your own, and this might be from friends that are also in charge of managing, large teams or remote teams. It might be someone within your organisation or your own manager, but having that peer support network where you can also troubleshoot and share your experiences is going to really help you make the most of how you support your team. The next one is the HSE Management Standards. So the Health and Safety Executive have set out key management standards for assessing the risk of stress-related ill health caused by work. And this is part of the Health and Safety at Work Act. These are all based on years of research into workplace health and behaviour. Now, you don't need to be a psychologist or an occupational health expert to understand these principles or how to implement them. So we'll have a look at what they are now. We've also got a line manager's guide for managing mental health, which I believe we will be able to share with people in the email that we send with a link to the recording of this webinar. But if you do want access to it beforehand, you can just get in touch with us and we can share a copy of it. It basically summarises some of the training that we offer for line managers. It summarises all of that information. So we look at what are some of the facts around mental health, what are some of the signs, how to conduct a risk assessment. So how do you establish whether someone might be a low risk, might be more at risk of needing support, and then how to actually approach the conversation and manage that. So that can be a really helpful resource for you. The HSE Management Standards, they cover 6 key areas of work design. And if these aren't properly managed, they can be associated with poor health, lower productivity, and increased accident and sickness absence rates. The first one is demands. So this includes issues such as workload, work patterns, and the work environment. So can employees deal with the demands of their job is a question to ask. Next one is control. How much how much say does the person have in the way they do their work? So there is a real well-established model in occupational psychology called the job demands resources and the demand control model. And it essentially finds that if people they have high demands on their shoulders, but very low control in what they're doing, it can significantly impact their well-being. If you think about having a job where you've got a lot of demands placed on your shoulders, but you have no control over how you do your job, it can be really, really challenging. But equally, if you have all of the control, but absolutely no demands on you at all, then we think back to the Yerkes-Dodson. It's harder to motivate yourself if you don't have any demands at all and you've got a very slow, monotonous job. This can have an impact. So these are two key areas that just being aware of can really significantly impact employees' well-being. The next is support, and this includes the encouragement, sponsorship and resources provided by the organisation, by line management and by colleagues. So do employees receive adequate support and information from both their colleagues and their superiors? Relationships include promoting positive working to avoid conflict and dealing with unacceptable behaviours such as bullying. And role. So do people understand their role within the organisation and whether their company ensures that they don't have conflicting roles? This can be something that is particularly prevalent in sort of small organisations where you've not got that many people, and usually you will see people that wear multiple hats. So you might have a HR manager who's also responsible for a variety of other things. They might be responsible for finance. They might also be responsible for all of the recruitment. If you start to have a blend of roles, it can be really, really difficult to establish clear boundaries, and an individual may feel like they don't fully understand what is expected of them from their role. And then that links back to having those high demands but not that much control. So making sure that roles are clearly defined is important. Finally, change. So how organisational change, be it large or small, is managed and communicated in the organisation. So if there is an upcoming change happening, however big or small, are employees frequently engaged with? Are they kept in the dark about it? Change can cause significant impacts on both team cohesion and well-being, and sometimes it can be easier to keep upcoming change quiet from people until it's happening, but this can actually have a more negative effect than if people are upfront about it from the get-go. So these are some of the standards. Now, if we go back to the last slide, this link here will take you to the HSE Management Standards page. If you're not familiar about it, it may be worth just having a quick read over. There's a lot of information on the HSE's website that really make things so clear about how certain factors in the working environment can impact employees' health and well-being, and what responsibilities managers have to be aware of those. So if you haven't come across those before, I really, really recommend having a look at them. And they've got useful resources on there as well that you can download and take away with you. I believe that comes to the end of our session. I want to open up for any questions now. I will have a look. I've got a couple of chats. Also, I wanted to invite anyone who has got experience managing a remote team. If there's anything that you found has worked particularly well or hasn't, be really keen to hear those in the chat function or via Q&A that I can share with the rest of the group. So I'll give you some time to submit your questions now. So we've got one question: what is the best way of encouraging staff to open up and share? I particularly find that when you share yourself, that's what encourages other people to share. So as a manager, if we think back to what we were saying about the modelling healthy behaviour, if you want your team to start opening up and sharing their experiences, and it's not really part of the way that you communicate at the moment, it's not going to be something that will happen overnight, and it's something that you have to start building into the culture. So simply having group meetings where, you know, you've, in this particular period of time, you've got your video switched on, and start by leading the conversation yourself. So when I have a one-to-one with my manager, for example, we do cover off questions that are related to things that are outside of work, whether there's any personal issues going on, anything to do with health, anything like that. And he will always start by sharing what's going on in his life first. And I've found that that really does help to create that that environment of mutual feedback. And some people are obviously going to feel like they don't want to open up in front of a whole team, so that's why it's really important to maintain that one-on-one contact with your team as well. So I hope that that has answered your question. We have one said, I work outside of normal hours due to health-related factors from time to time. This means that I do send emails out of normal hours. We don't have core hours anymore. If I'm sending an email very late, I schedule it for the next day. If it's the early part of the evening, I just send it. My team know that I have a health condition to manage. Do you think this is okay? I do. Yeah, I think that's absolutely fine. If you've got a it depends on each individual situation, but if your team are aware of particular adjustments that need to happen from either your own perspective or other people's, then everyone's on the same page. And I'm not saying that you can't send an email after 5 p.m, but I've seen emails from people sort of 10, 11, 12 p.m, and most of us have access to those on our phone. So if we are in bed on our phone or whatever it might be, you are generally more encouraged to then go and open that email. So it's just being mindful of the fact that if you do send emails very, very late at night or first thing in the morning, if it's not the norm, or if you don't have that established with your team, then it can't hurt to just schedule it. You know, if you're sending an email at 5 in the morning, you can schedule it for 2 hours, 3 hours later. Things probably won't fall apart in that time unless you're in the kind of 24/7 cycle of work. I hope that was helpful. Where do you draw the line between being a caring manager / counsellor to a vulnerable employee, and what is the best step to lead that vulnerable employee to seek further help? The key thing here is that you are not a counsellor. So a manager should never feel like it is your responsibility to provide any kind of support like that to your employee. It's important to create a conversation and have that trusting relationship, so that if you are worried about someone, that you can have the conversation with them and say, I'm worried about you, I want to help you seek support if it's relevant. But it's really important to set clear boundaries between and set standards for your staff as well, because if you start communicating with them, and for example, we've had managers that have given their mobile numbers to their to employees, who then start contacting them in the middle of the night, and it can put a lot of pressure on you as a manager. So it's important to really keep that boundary there, but also know how to actually start and approach the conversation. Someone said, in my last organisation, we used a pressure point survey once a year that covered the HSE Management Standards, and the results helped line managers know what was and what wasn't working for their people. I'm not sure if this was developed by that organisation or if there's a general survey. So the HSE do have a a tool called the HSE Stress Indicator tool. They have it available via paper format, but the way that you have to analyse the data is through Excel, which can be quite time consuming, and if you don't understand it, it can be quite laborious. So they have created an online version which employees just go on. It's 35 questions and then they populate the results. There is a fee for doing this, and it's up to your individual organisation to contact HSE and find out how much it is and how to administer it, but it's not that much. But you can also take the questions from that paper and put them into your own wellbeing survey or whatever it is, because I know that some companies have lots and you don't want to overload people with surveys, but even just being aware of the kind of factors that feed into that stress risk assessment can really help you as a line manager. The next one I've got is one of my team is very young and lives alone. She doesn't sound herself to me, but keeps saying she is fine. What else can I do to identify if her mental health is suffering? When we give training on mental health awareness for line managers, one of the things that we sort of encourage is you look for a change in normal behaviour. And if you've got a good relationship with members of your team, then it's usually quite easy to realise if something isn't quite right. But you have to also appreciate that people are responsible as well for their own mental well-being. So if you're asking someone if they're okay, and you've tried it, time and time again, and each time they say they're okay, there does get to a point where you do have to be respectful of that. And you might want to try different ways of communicating. So it depends on how you're actually talking to them. If you're asking them, are they feeling fine, in a general day-to-day chat, then that might not really be the right environment to have that conversation, because the individual might feel like they don't want to put anything on you. So that's where it comes down to making significant time to actually talk to that individual. So, you might have a one-to-one coming up, or you might schedule some time to catch up, and make it a good period of time, whether it's half an hour or an hour, and just be honest and say, I'm a bit concerned about you, and try and have a bit more of an open conversation like that. It is very difficult though, because if someone doesn't want help, or if they don't want to share it with you, then you're limited to what you can do. But if you're generally really, really concerned about someone's health, then I would recommend speaking to someone within your HR team if they're not responding. We've got a next one. As a manager, unfortunately, I cannot interact with my team via webcams or group meetings, as we don't have laptops or headsets. We just have a group chat facility. I find this quite challenging. Do you have any advice in this instance? Yeah, this is challenging. I mean, I don't know what the process is for work. I mean, there are kind of ways that you can set up chats, like on Zoom, for example. If you can't get them on your work laptop, I don't know whether you can actually do that yourself. If it's something that you are finding challenging, if people have a smartphone, for example, you can usually create a group on WhatsApp and you can do video calls that way. Most people have access to Skype. Again, if you've got a tablet or a computer or a smartphone, you can access Skype very easily, and you don't need to have a paid business account to do that. But it might be something worth actually raising with your HR or occupational health team, if you have one, because this is quite important. And if you can figure out a way of actually having those remote meetings with some kind of face-to-face contact, then that would be better. So I think it would be worth actually having a chat with someone internally about that.